Hi, guys. Welcome to the Entitled Podcast. If you are new here or returning, thank you for coming in to listen to me yap today. And I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite segments of this podcast, which is called Cinematic Crumbs. But this episode is going to be a little bit different than my usual episode of Cinematic Crumbs, where I talk about movies. Instead, this one is going to focus on a specific genre that I have been seeing has its good and its bad, downfalls. And it seems to be a sort of repeated pattern throughout this genre. And as you can imagine, the genre itself is WLW content, specifically the shows in which I had talked about in my previous YouTube video and pod, where I pretty much ranked every sapphic show I've ever watched. And I'm going to be basing it off of that because it was sort of like a reminder of the certain things that I remember when watching those shows. And as a disclaimer, I would just like to put out that this isn't region bound, this isn't language bound, this isn't race bound, or any sort of restrictions. Like, this isn't just exclusive to like Thailand, where they pump out a lot of more GL media in comparison to the West or even the US, period. Like, this isn't, exclusive to one people or the other. It's more of just a general thing that I keep seeing over and over in terms of different storylines and different toxic behaviors in terms of the bad. But, let's start off this podcast with some good, because, sapphic media has been very depressing as it's been progressing through the different waves of media. But let's start out with the good, and then we'll get into the bad, and we'll have some sort of, I guess you could call it some sort of resolution or just questions at the end. So, starting off with the good. I believe that the sapphic media and the sapphic shows that are coming out, just in general, are finally the things that I wish that I had when I was younger and yearning to see those sort of depictions on screen. As a person who has been in the closet for a very long time without much representation and not knowing what that can look like, has been a sort of iffy, bumpy road, because I never really knew what could be of the relationship based on me just pretty much seeing depictions of only, straight couples throughout my life. And I believe representation for all groups of people, whether that is through sexuality, religion, race, whatever you may think of, through identity, period, it can serve as a great tool to provide light and to provide a voice and to explore that identity and have it be shown to people that fit within it. And it can be a very powerful tool for people to feel connected to when other pieces of media that they usually interact with on a day-to-day basis doesn't apply to them. And I believe with now being in my 20s and seeing this, I'm like, this is the stuff that I wanted to see when I was younger, like these different interactions between two girls and what love could look like. And granted, it is through media, so of course it's romanticized to an extent, but I just think it was good representation, period. Representation is always needed, and I think they're doing a really good job of getting those stories out there in the mainstream now. I remember that back in 2018 when I had first seen, not 2018, but like 2022, when the first like mainstream big Thai GL came out and I watched it for the first time. Granted, it was not perfect and it wasn't like the best thing that I've ever seen in terms of a show, but it was representation and I was chewing it up, even if it was drama filled, even if it wasn't the best acting, XYZ you may think of, right, when watching it. But I was very excited to see it, and I didn't have to like comb through the woods and lake and everything else in between in order to find that media, which in comparison to like a movie like Debs, for example, you have to do some deep research in order to find that, media. Like, it isn't out there for you to be like, oh, this story is about sapphics, let me click on it. It was like you had to go through a Reddit thread or just stumble upon it in order to find it. I think that's also a good thing that they're doing. And I think that as time goes on, based from what I've seen, we're starting to see a lot more diverse groups of people. We're starting to see a lot more different versions of women being portrayed on screen. I think there's been a massive push just in general for more inclusion and diversity in terms of media, period. But I think those things are starting to make its way into the queer space, and specifically the sapphic space as well. Granted, there is what is being called the swirlification of it all, which is why I think a part of me sort of gravitates more towards sapphic media outside of the US, because there's less swirlification, if that makes sense. I've seen more depictions of people of color within that area outside of the US versus like here. What I mean by swirlification, if you aren't familiar with it, there are definitely more videos about it, specifically relating to queer media, but it's been very consistent even in straight media as well, that there seems to be this tendency with Hollywood and the mainstream of, if there's going to be a person of color, they must be with a white person within their love arc. And that is essentially the swirlification. Like, when was the last time that you had seen two POCs happily together, or the same POC with each other and living a happy, healthy relationship? Crickets, right? Crickets. I fear crickets. And that's essentially what this swirlification is. I could think of many times where this has happened. You can think of Euphoria with Rue and what's her name? Jules. Rue and Jules. They're swirlified. You can think about Emily and Allison from Pretty Little Liars. Like, a lot of the sapphic media in the US specifically has been very much geared toward white audiences, especially in the early 2000s and early 2010s, where most of these other groups of people weren't the main audience and or not seen to be a part of the main audience. And so therefore many people that looked like them weren't given an opportunity to fit within the storyline, especially since, sapphic media during that time was at a very small, abundance, a very small amount. So you definitely saw that there wasn't much diversity there. And now that we're getting out of that slowly, you're starting to see more people of color, but it's unfortunately being swirlified. I think the first time that has been within the US that I haven't seen it be swirlified was with the movie Bottoms, where you have Josie, who is black, and then you have Isabella, who is, or Isabel. It's either Isabella or Isabel. I think it's Isabel, who's Asian. And so that was probably the first time. And mind you, that movie came out in 2020. This is me going off of my dome. This came out in 2023, 2024. Don't quote me on that. But it was years ago. And that was how recent that movie was. And that was probably the first time that I haven't seen it swirlified. So there was a swirlification of that. And I think that we're having a little bit more stride in trying to tell stories that don't revolve around, one, a white audience, two, a white narrative. And just allowing people that look different and have different backstories and intersectionalities have a place for their stories to be told within this, space of media. I think we're doing better with that. And I think that sort of wraps up the good in which has been happening with, Willowa content recently. We're starting to see more of it. It's coming more of the mainstream, so you don't have to hunt for it. And on top of that, we're getting better stories in terms of diversity. Those three things are what's going good thus far. Granted, still very early sort of, genre, but we're making some strides. However, here's where we get on to the bad, right? The bad has been formulating itself in a very, very particular way that is very reminiscent of straight media. I feel like a lot of directors and or producers or both are either men and or people that just aren't supposed to be in those spaces and call those shots, because you can tell that with some of the formulations of these sapphic couples that they aren't necessarily what a sapphic relationship looks like. It feels more along the lines of this lady is the quote-unquote man, this girl is the more feminine one, so therefore she is the lady. And the more masculine one takes on the role, takes on the, breadwinning status and XYZ. They fulfill this spot of man and woman, even though they're both girls. And we're kind of missing the plot with that, right? And we're kind of also, by extension, going even further than that, from the different caricature of being like mask and femme sapphic and being like the standard for a lesbian couple or a sapphic couple, period. There's also a lot of tropes, a lot of toxic tropes that I keep seeing be reused and recycled from like hetero and straight tropes that often come from dark romance, quote unquote dark romance, that I'm seeing being translated into queer spaces. And I don't like it because of the fact that these very awful actions are being, one, romanticized, two, are being introduced early to a genre that is already stigmatized and hasn't had the time to fully grow with the amount of selection that there is available. And so to, allow such a strong and very influential narrative to come into a new genre, it seems very bad. But also on top of that, just the fact that it's being romanticized and not being talked about in the sense of a light of, this can happen to you, but this should not be liked or loved or accepted or excused. However, that is unfortunately what I've been seeing the most, especially with what I've been consuming lately, which is Thai GL, because of the fact of the Thai industries are working hard day and night to provide their sapphic community with a crap load of shows. Like, I kid you not, ever since Gap the series was released, they have been on a whirlwind of a cash cow to produce as many GLs, like loved GLs, for not only their sapphic communities, but as well as worldwide. And it's been working internationally. Like, it's been doing its rounds. And it's because there's a want and a need for sapphic representation in the media, because a lot of countries like my own don't really get that many of them. Like, it's every blue moon that we get a gay story, let alone a sapphic story. So it's just very little amount of media to work with. So where do you go? You go internationally. Here's this country that quite literally pops these things out like crazy. And some of them really do have very good, like, telenovela drama styled drama about it and a good TV show. And some of them are low budget. Some of them are straight up crappy. But you eat it up anyways, because it's sort of like a guilty pleasure of like, finally, I'm able to see the things that I want. And even though it's crappy, I'll still watch it anyways. Or even if it's good, I'll watch it anyways. And that's the media that I've been pretty much on a binge with, is Thai GL media. Mostly because of the drama of it all, and also it's with sapphic. So I was like, girl, Sign me up. Like, who am I to judge? Sign me up. And it definitely showed itself because I have an issue, right? And this is on me. This is completely on me for doing this to myself. But I have a issue with not looking at synopsis before, or looking at the novels that most of these things are based off of, to before like watching them, essentially. Like, I won't look at a synopsis of a movie. I won't look at a synopsis of a book most of the time. I will literally just go off of vibes, and it's sort of like a surprise mystery box for me that way to see what's going to happen. However, most of these GLs I know for a fact are being advertised as a love story, as a romantic story. That's why when a lot of these things that happen within them that I often see be, one, commercialized, two, excused, and even normalized in a lot of straight media, is essentially translating itself and transmitting itself to queer media. And that's where I'm like, ooh, babe, that's not it. That's not it at all. Because why are we repeating the same mistakes that have already been talked about over and over and over again with just critics of those same areas with, straight couples? We should not be doing the same with sapphic media, especially since it's brand new and we're just now getting the series. For example, the first one in which I had seen, which was Gap the series. Gap the series has a lot of issues. Granted, not as bad as the follow-up ones that are going to come in the next couple of years after that, but just like off the bat with Gap the series. Apparently, I believe it's a little bit more tame than the novel, because the novels be batshit. Listen to me carefully. Batshit crazy. Like, I'm talking like they are out here doing the most heinous things to either one another, or whichever one is the more feminine girl, the more submissive girl. She's been like dragged around like a rag doll. And this is where you get your first instances of that in Gap the series, because you have Mon and Sam, who has like a 8 or 9 year age gap. There's age gap issues, there's boss and employee issues, which again, the whole trope thing that we've seen in straight media that often, plays around power dynamics that can be very toxic. And within Gap the series, it explores that by literally showing bluntly and blatantly that it is toxic. However, what it doesn't do a good job of is showing that this toxicity isn't good, that this toxicity isn't a result of this wounded boss lady. Like, it shouldn't be excused because of the fact that she endured childhood trauma. Like, we should be showing people and telling people, like, hey, this isn't normal, this isn't great, this isn't XYZ. But there's a lot of things. Like, their first time having sexual relations with each other, they both had to get drunk. Like, they planned to get drunk, first off a brown liquor. That stuff is strong. Y'all drank a lot of brown liquor and got tipsy tipsy liquor drunk off of brown liquor in order for you guys to be able to have your first time. I don't think that's, the best way of going about that. But again, these are just a couple examples from the first one that I had seen. And it gets heinous. And it feels like as time goes on, the worse it gets. Because, again, I already told you about those things. Like, the boss, aka Sam, she literally used her power as her boss to her employee, Mon, to try and get her essentially fired from her job. And mind you, think about the age gap, think about the power dynamic, think about the socioeconomic difference. Mon is I would say, upper middle class girl. Sam, on the other hand, has generational wealth because she is tied, like, by blood to the royal family of Thailand. Like, that is the sort of power dynamic that we're working from off the bat. And again, like I said, this isn't region bound or XYZ, but it just keeps getting worse with that. It just keeps getting worse. And you see this pattern, and again, it's not only them, because I'm pretty sure there are definitely some like WLW shows out there in the West that I just haven't touched that have issues like this, that are often portraying these very toxic relationships, but sort of putting it in the light of being very goofy or very silly or not that serious. Because I kid you not, I can look at this list, in which I already have prepared from my previous ranking video, and tell you which one of these has issues with them. Again, I have been looking at Thai GL as a binge. So it's just like, babe, I only have so much to work with. And I think most of these are from Thailand. There's one from South Korea, Japan, a couple from the US. Yeah, that's it. Oh, and one from Germany. And that's about it. I would say out of this whole tier list, the ones that are the most healthy is like 23.5. Oddly enough, Clarabelle is pretty healthy considering the fact that they are both in prison. Granted, one of them is wrongfully convicted and so is technically the other. Spoiler. But they're both in jail, and somehow they have a good relationship dynamic for the most part. If anything, the only odd part is the very prominent age gap and Claire's anger issues, which she doesn't take out on her partner, but you know, they're still present. Drook, I would say, is one. However, it does have some instances of bullying in there. Specifically, this is not the series, but the one that focuses on Fatu and Kumi. And it has some instances of bullying, miscommunication, but I feel like it's very high school-esque sort of sapphic relationship. It was cute. It was good. It was relatively healthy. What else do I have up here that was, healthy? Well Store, that was healthy. And I forgot the title of this one, but I'm gonna wing it. I think it's like Ayaka-chan is in love with Hiroko. And I would even venture out to say First Kill, even though it had bad, it had bad acting and the budget was very low. But at the same time, babe, we're getting, sapphic led media and Netflix. Like, how much are we expecting? This is their first go, and unfortunately it got discontinued, along with I'm Not Okay With This, from what I can remember. And what is this called? Something Mirrors, Couple of Mirrors, I think is what it's called. But yeah, those were all healthy, but the ones that aren't, they're very prominent. Like, even things like Killing Eve, you see that, of course, the girl is a serial killer, but it's just the very toxic, tension, infatuation which one another has for each other that leads to ultimately, spoiler alert, I remind you, spoiler is coming up, leads to their destruction. Specifically, I forgot what her name was. The other girl that isn't Eve. It leads to her destruction at the end, along with her work. But yeah, I keep seeing these patterns, specifically within the novel adaptation films, that are very odd. And I'll be talking about the movie Bottoms, like I said I would, even though this is mostly about the tier list that I made. I will be making a mention of Bottoms because, girl, the US, you are not getting away from me in this conversation. You will be dealt with. But for example, what was one that really shocked me? Oh, Harmony's Secret, for example. I love the actresses. Look me, Sonia, both incredible actresses. I fear they have a lot of potential. They can work well with the script in which they are given. However, based on what I read and what I had seen, girl, apparently on Reddit, the novel is incredibly different from what the actual, TV show gave, which is very on par with a lot of GL series, right? But there's, again, these patterns of predatory behavior, specifically being typecasted on the more masculine of the two. Mind you, there is I was about to say tradition. Yeah, essentially at this point, there's a tradition within these GLs of casting very feminine looking women and then putting the more quote unquote masculine or direct one or assertive one as the top in the relationship and therefore the aggressor. And again, these are all falling into archetypes that are aligned with being a man in a very heterosexual way. And again, these are about two women. What is a man doing here? What is a man doing here in a gay ass show, in a gay ass movie? Why are we making archetypes that are reminiscent of tropes and characteristics that don't even apply? But back to Harmony's Secret specifically, you have, granted, they don't have the weird age gap like Blank does. Blank genuinely needs to be locked up. Blank feels like a PEDO film, to be honest. And I forced myself to watch it all the way through because everybody was raving and raving about it. And I was like, girl, why was this normalized in such a way? This feels borderline PDEO because of the age gap. But anyways, back to Harmony's Secret. You have these instances with the character that Look Me plays called, her name is A. Warren, I think is how you say it. But she goes by I, so I Warren. And she consistently goes against boundaries of May's. She literally unconsensually kissed her the first day that they had seen each other since 13 years ago. She drugged her for information. She said a very, very concerning line of, after they had their first time together as a couple, I had pretty much asked May, like, hey, did you like what we just did? Which is crazy on its own, because what do you mean you had to ask your partner if they liked what you did and not ask that if it was okay during the actual activity, but okay. But she asked her for essentially a Yelp review, like a feedback. And May questioned her of like, if I said I liked it, what would you say? I goes, I'd do it again. And then May hits her with the reverse, which was, if I said I didn't like it, then what would you say? Old girl goes, I'd do it again until you liked it. Cut the mic. Cut the motherfucking mic. Cut the motherfucking mic right now. Absolutely right now. Are you kidding me? This was normalized R-word culture as blatantly as it could be. What do you mean your response to your partner who said that they didn't like a sexual activity that you guys just did after the fact, said that they didn't want to do it anymore and they don't like it, and you say as a response, I would do it again until you liked it, meaning you would repetitively don't do it until they essentially were able to somehow find quote unquote pleasure from it, which I think is quite literally impossible. That is what I mean by it is framed in this way to seem very romantic, because if you were to look at that series, right, or just look at the scene in which I'm referencing to, you have this piano in the back and this tone of like vulnerability of the two, but it doesn't feel sinister. It doesn't feel like May's in danger. It feels more of like casual, like vulnerable conversation that you have after, sex. And I'm so confused by it because I'm like, why is it being framed in this way when this is practically R-word culture at its finest? Like we're just gonna drive past that. We're gonna run over that. Another one, affair of the series. Girl, the unhingedness of the more aggressive or aggressor in these GLs are out of whack. Affair of the series, she literally almost offs herself because she cannot have the girl. She literally kept her low-key sort of caged in her home, changing their power dynamic when the other girl was, one, sick with the flu, two, had nowhere else to go and live. Even with, like, what's it called? What is this called? Poisonous love? As you can imagine, you sort of have some sort of idea that this isn't going to be the most healthiest relationship. Babe, I didn't know that the novel was incredibly sinister more than what the actual series was. Because I looked on Reddit first, and it said that the novel was worse than the series. The novel had essay. They put a question mark, so I'm guessing essay. Had SA, had blackmail, had exploitation, had stalking. Anything that you can think of, it was in there. And in the actual series in which I had watched, which mind you, I was watching kind of it in the background. I didn't have my full attention on it. But it was definitely stalking behavior. It was normalized stalking behavior that was coming off as whimsical and very goofy of the character instead of, exploring the fact that these awful crimes and things of this sort can happen to women who are sapphic by women, which I think is a greater conversation that we should have within our community, because I feel like it's often not seen as legitimate because of the fact of there's no man involved, or even in cases of SA, because there is no, PENIS involved, that there's no R word, technically, quote unquote, is what people argue. Like, I feel like these would be great conversations to have, especially of survivors of DV or SA or stalking while being in a sapphic relationship. I think it needs to be talked about more because the queer community isn't, restricted to, sunshines and rainbows and hate crimes. Like, there are evil people within the community as well. This isn't rocket science. And if that were to be explored through media, if the topic were to be handled in a TV show, you would expect that it would be handled with care to talk about the issue, to show the impact of what it causes on the character, not for it to be a sort of segue into them getting closer together and them ending up in a relationship by the end without much attention or explanation as to what's going on, like these TV shows often depict. And again, I keep seeing these patterns, and it's very explicitly and not really like beat around the bush being shown in the film, but it's not being handled with care and or being brought up in the way that it needs to, as in recognizing that these things are awful and recognizing that these things can happen to sapphic people in relationships, and recognizing as a bigger community that this doesn't need to be normalized. Because I saw the comments. There would be one person who would bring up a non-consensual kiss or some sort of creepy behavior that happened between two characters and pretty much call out the character that was being creepy. And there would be, I'm supposing, since this is sapphic, women in the comments just going off on the person, being like, it wasn't that serious, like, it's just, a little bit of dark romance, any sort of excuse that you could think of to essentially eliminate the fact that this is, one, either a crime straight out, and or two, just acknowledging it as an issue that didn't need to be swept under the rug by producers and writers of this show. And I bring up the movie Bottoms because as much as I loved Bottoms, because I was so hungry and so deprived of good sapphic media at the time, and I just ate up Bottoms without actually taking the time, except for like later on, to recognize that the actual premise of Bottoms is very creepy at its basis. And as much as I loved the very, cunty, very camp nature of Bottoms, and it was sapphic, and it had, the main character have, another POC as well as a love interest, no swirlification there. Like, I was happy to see that, and I was eating it up. And as soon as the hype went down and I looked at it again, I was like, ooh, girl. Ooh, babe. I think we have an issue. Something is wrong with America. Like, I think we have an issue. Because if you don't know Bottoms, right? The whole reason why they made that Fight Club in the first place wasn't for the empowerment of women, wasn't for protection of women. In fact, in a very predatory nature, it was to have a club that would bring women in unknowingly to the club. So these two idiots, PJ and Josie, would be able to finally get together with their, very popular crushes that they had in the school. They didn't care about the other girls. In fact, they gave less of two craps about the other girls until, like, the club actually started to gain meaning for everybody. But even then, just the basis of this club was made in order to exploit these women and to essentially get into the two popular girls' pants off the bat without them even really recognizing or knowing what's going on with the club. Because again, everybody is under the guise that they're going to be in this club to protect themselves, not have this extra layer of, these two girls, say if you're in Isabel's spot or her friend's spot, I think her name was Brittany. Yeah, Brittany or Isabel's spot of, having two people actively trying to get at you when you don't even know it. Like, that is very scary. That is inherently predatory. And it's not a good way to try and approach somebody that you have a crush with. And they don't necessarily, I think they partially essentially tap on the fact that this was wrong. They definitely do within the film. They bring it up as a sort of breaking point for everybody in the group that, yes, this is a terrible thing to do. This was something that they admit to doing. And the basis and foundation of the relationships in which you've built from this club have essentially been on predatory, foundation. But again, the fact that it was there in the first place, it's giving the same pattern of, like, you have aggressors, you have predatory people, you have sometimes even going into a very darker place of, like, non-consensual kisses, whether they're drunk or just didn't expect it, and DV, SA, and other things, exploitation, blackmail, stalking. Like, it's becoming a pattern. It's becoming a pattern that I don't like to see, and I wish that there was more care being given into these areas, and even to the more lighter ones that you wouldn't even expect for there to be these things and these elements in. they still have these elements in weird age gaps, everything in between. Like, based on my tier list, I think the only ones that don't really have those, if let me see if I can find one that doesn't have any like sort of red flag in it at all. A Couple of Mirrors is one of them. Druk is the closest one that you'll get with Fatu and QB. 23.5. And yeah, that's it. Out of that whole list, that is the only couple of films I could say isn't incredibly problematic and as close as you can get to, fluffiest of fluff. And the reason why, if you're watching this on YouTube, the reason why I'm not putting Hiroko and Ayaka in that category is because of the fact of, even though, you know what, actually I will put them in that category because of the fact that they do seem to do a good job of acknowledging the power dynamic between the two, having an age gap, and as well as the power imbalance of being a boss and employee, well, a manager and employee, as well as the struggle of internal homophobia as well. I will put them in that category because they actually do take the time and care to bring up those issues, and it was adapted from a great novel that explores those issues without having these characters do awful and exploitative things to their partner in the process. So yeah, that's the issues that I've been seeing with just Willowwood content repetitively, and I don't like what's happening. I wish we would do more of what the film of like Hiroko and Ayaka-chan did, essentially, by, if you're going to have those topics in there, place them in a light of uncomfortability and seriousness. Don't have them as a whimsical trait that leads to, the development of people coming together more. Because what I fear will become the sort of main thing, I guess you could say, result of that sort of media being consistently pushed out, is that younger audiences like myself, if I were like, a teenager when this came out, all these, GLs came out, I would have probably thought like, oh, this is like a normal sort of behavior for you to be able to get a girlfriend. Like, you have to be aggressive. You have to show that you want her by doing these very creepy and unnatural sort of behaviors in order to show her that you like her and love her, XYZ. I think just because, a lot of these younger queer / sapphic people have access to this now at a very young age, and granted, they shouldn't be looking at this if they're not 18 and older, but I know that when I was a teenager, I was watching stuff that was definitely for 18 and plus. So there's only so much restriction that can be done with that. But if we're going to push out media in general, even for adults, especially regarding sapphic genre that is relatively new, there should be some sort of nuance and fleshing out when it comes to those more serious topics of unconsensual kissing, SA, DV, blackmailing, stalking, and any other heinous thing that can come from being in a relationship with somebody. And I think it shouldn't be romanticized as it's been continuously going on, as you can see through the multiple GLs, if you watch GLs as well. But yeah, if you have any comments or any thoughts about this, definitely leave it down below in the comments section of the YouTube video. If you're listening to this on a podcast, thank you for tuning in. These are my thoughts on the whole thing. I hope that not only within, specifically the sapphic genre of romance, that this gets better, but as well as the BL, which means boys love, genre as well, because my lord, the gay shows and movies that have been pushed out, which I had to take a break from because of the fact that they were so inherently R-word cultured, if that makes sense. Like, there was just so much unconsensual aspects to it that I just could not keep watching at some points. So I took a break from it. And I watched, the closest thing that I watched was, well, not closest, but the most recent thing that I had watched was Heated Rivalry and White, Red, and Blue. And those were pretty good and okay. I definitely do have some of my gripes with that, but I don't think it has to be necessarily like the healthiest couple of healthy. Like I said before, if you're going to have these things and these topics in shows, don't romanticize them, don't make them seem like fairy tale-ish, and every single narrative of the queer experience doesn't need to be straight cut, sort of, reuse, recycle. It can be different, but just make sure you do it right. Same thing goes for the straights, because my lord, hetero media, babe, we see where the foundation came from, because look what y'all got over there. Look what y'all got over there. I look at hetero romance as well, and my lord, it'll be looking crazy at times. What do you mean you took that man back after he treated you like crazy? What do you mean he literally did X, Y, and Z and that was a crime, but we're taking him back? Like, I don't understand this. And I think we just need to not revitalize, but we need to workshop, for sure. We need to workshop the romance genre as a whole, and we need to also go into those other genres that are, freshly forming and make the change in the beginning before it gets too late and you just keep reusing and recycling. And yeah, that's it. That's all I have. I hope you enjoyed. Eat, drink, sleep well. And this is the end of this podcast. Well, this specific episode. This is the outro. Bye.